Hello and welcome to the F1 Strategy Report, powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. My name's Michael Lamonato, and this is round 17, the Japanese Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton was flawless in Japan, dominating the race and extending his championship lead to 67 points. But could this race have finished any other way? To help analyse the outcome of Grand Prix from Motorsport Monday and Motorsport Week, I'm joined by Phil Horton. Phil, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Doing very well in beautiful Japanese sunshine after a fairly mixed weather condition kind of weekend. It fined up for the race. Unfortunately for Sebastian Vettel, didn't fine up for his championship prospects.
Well, I think we arrived in Japan thinking it was quite a long shot that Sebastian Vettel and Ferrari were going to take the championship away from Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes. And the way the weekend panned out just cemented that view. In fairness, it went wrong in qualifying. It went well for one lap, and then after the safety car restart, it all fell apart again. And with Lewis Hamilton winning and Sebastian Vettel sixth, that's pretty much the title race done and dusted. Yes,
and now the mathematics is that it could actually be done by the next round in Austin, if not then almost certainly by Mexico, you'd think, providing there's no catastrophe that befalls Mercedes, as Toto Wolff said, I think a freak accident.
Yes.
Which, well, you never know, but it's a done deal at this point.
Yeah.
It's a done deal. You said it did go wrong from the very beginning. From the very beginning, from practice pretty much.
Well, if you look at the weekend, Mercedes had a plan, they executed it. Lewis Hamilton topped every single practice session, topped Q1, only fell behind Valtteri Bottas briefly in Q2 when they ran the soft tyres, and then obviously topped qualifying. In practice, the Mercedes was clearly the quicker car as it was in Russia, and Ferrari were just chasing their tails throughout. They didn't have the pace, either short run or long run, and then that obviously went through into qualifying.
And I think it's important to note, because we are obviously going to be talking about, in qualifying in particular, and to a lesser extent in the race, mistakes Ferrari's made, as has been a bit of a narrative in the latter part of this season.
Yeah.
But it is important to note that Mercedes is doing an outstanding job at this point. I mean, they've rocked up with a car in the last couple of races after having the second best car and delivering a car that is far and away, in terms of tenths of a second, even if it's only that narrow, the best car on the grid. They've not really given Ferrari a chance at all. They've executed so cleanly. And in that respect, you've really got to pay credit to them to sealing this championship, not just waiting for Ferrari to fall over themselves.
Oh, absolutely. You look before the summer break, and Ferrari had the quicker car at Silverstone, they had the quicker car in Germany, they had the quicker car in Hungary, but on the latter two of those occasions, Mercedes profited from Ferrari's mistakes or circumstances such as the weather. And then when Formula One returned from its summer break in Belgium, Ferrari had the quicker car at Spa-Francorchamps. Sebastian Vettel passed Lewis Hamilton fairly easily for the victory, and then Hamilton could not live with Vettel primarily through the slow speed bus stop chicane and Lassos hairpin, which was costing them traction and then speed down the straights. So Mercedes went away, effectively looked at those two corners and said, that's what we need to fix, not only the traction but how it operates with understanding the tyres. Went to Monza and the teams were fairly equal, although Ferrari just edged it, and then Mercedes and Hamilton went out and won a race they probably shouldn't have won. But ever since then, Hamilton won Singapore basically based upon a brilliant Q3 lap and perfect out-lap preparation that Ferrari didn't do. And then in Russia they just turned up, had the quicker car and carried that through to Japan.
Which brings us to here, where it was a fairly effortless win for Lewis Hamilton. One more important thing to note throughout practice is that this really was a weekend of two distinctly different weather conditions. This will play a part later on in the race. During practice, and even especially during qualifying when rain did eventually arrive, we were looking at fairly grey skies, overcast conditions. Quite cool actually for this time, well, normally compared to the weather we get this time in Japan when there's not a typhoon. Completely different on Sunday. It was around about 30 degrees during the day, track temps were much higher, and that had a significant effect.
Yeah, it was very hot on Sunday, even from early morning, which clearly meant that teams were not necessarily wary of the degradation, but more of blistering. Because several times this season we've seen drivers come out of the pits, push too hard to start with, blister the rear tyres, and then they're screwed. So in that respect, Mercedes, and especially Lewis Hamilton, they didn't get that because they were so far in front that they could just simply control the pace and, they had no need to push so hard. And the rest of the field, some of them had blistering problems, but ultimately I don't think it had as big an impact as maybe some feared pre-race, especially considering some of the data that has come through on Friday.
Talking about the tyres, this race it was the medium soft and super soft compounds that Pirelli brought. The soft was expected to be the backbone of strategy. It wasn't actually ended up being like that, despite the fact most teams brought only 1 or 2 sets of the medium. That ended up sort of being the dominant tyre. But in qualifying in Q2, as you know, the Q2 session is when you choose the tyres you'll start the race on if you progress into Q3. Mercedes had no trouble using the soft tyre rather than the super soft, meaning that they would start on the more flexible, strategically speaking, tyre. Are you surprised that other teams didn't attempt that, considering Ferrari or Red Bull Racing surely would have viewed that situation as probably a bit of a strategic disadvantage for the race?
I was surprised that Ferrari didn't do it, because I think given the pace, even though Mercedes probably had a pace advantage of a few tenths, if not half a second, Ferrari still should have had a pace advantage such that they could easily have got to Q3 on the soft tyre. I mean, Romain Grosjean managed it in the Haas. So if Grosjean can manage it, you'd like to think both Vettel and Raikkonen could also have managed it. With Red Bull, I think they were probably looking at the more aggressive strategy. You know, Mercedes are thinking, we want to play it as safe, as to the book as possible. You know, you look at what they did. They did soft medium, stopped, I think, lap 26 or somewhere around that. I think they were 1 lap away from what Pirelli outlined as the optimum strategy. So they played it by the book. I think Red Bull probably looked at it from the perspective of, we want to go out and attack, and the best way of attacking is to have the super softs and then take on the softs rather than go soft medium. It nearly worked out for them. So to get back to answering your question, I'm surprised Ferrari didn't do it, but not surprised that Red Bull decided to go a bit more aggressive.
That would prove to be the least of Ferrari's tyre problems in qualifying, because in a very high-profile way, it was an error. Although it's interesting that this weekend, I think we've been spending a lot of time trying to define exactly what error means in certain contexts. Ferrari, seeing the rain had arrived at the end of Q2 and the break between Q2 and Q3, had to decide whether or not the very beginning of Q1 would be slick or intermediate tyre conditions. They decided intermediate, but unfortunately for them, were the only team to have done so. And in the end of the day, Mercedes was able to set provisional pole, which then ended up becoming pole with that super soft slick tyre. Is that necessarily an error, though? Obviously, in retrospect, it was the wrong choice, but is it understandable that they would have chosen the intermediate?
When you have those mixed weather conditions, there's always someone that's going to look like a hero and someone that's going to look a bit foolish. I think back to Spa when you had the mixed conditions in Q3, and Red Bull took the strategy of trying to go early, and then it backfired because of how the weather played out, whereas Force India left it late and got a second row lockout. Here it was a little bit different in that the rain fell at the end of Q2 enough to ensure that the guys trying to improve at the end of Q2 couldn't. It was that wet. But it had stopped in that little window between Q2 and Q3, and it was so hot and muggy and windy on Saturday that the circuit was drying ever so quickly, and it's also quite an undulating circuit, so the water that is there does drain off quite quickly when it's not raining. When considering that Q3 took place at the start of Q3, it was dry. In that situation, you'd surely think the best thing to do is to head out as soon as possible on the super softs, so you can get that lap in, because if you do and then it rains, there's no point, because the best of the track conditions have gone. If you were to go out on super softs and then it started raining and you didn't get that first lap in, but no one got that first lap in, it wouldn't have mattered. The issue for Ferrari is that they went out on intermediates when they didn't need to, because it wasn't wet enough. The others went out on super softs because it was dry enough. And then that was the first mistake. The second mistake, of course, was all Vettel's, because he needed that first lap because the rain, they could see it on the radar, the rain was coming. He didn't get that first lap in, went wide at Spoon, was left in 9th, and by the time he went out to improve, a few minutes later the rain had come down. I can understand what he means, where if the rain had arrived, Ferrari would look like heroes, but then in that case everyone would have taken on intermediate tyres anyway. So in that circumstance, it's that if you played the safe option, he would have probably been 3rd, giving him a better chance of attacking Mercedes off the line and in the race. Taking the gamble left him 9th, which then became 8th with a penalty for Esteban Ocon. So it was, you can kind of understand the mindset, but then it's in equal measure, you can't understand why they did it.
Yeah. Looking to some of the comments that Maurizio Arrivabene made afterwards as the team principal, he was quite angry. In fact, I think that was his words, that I'm angry.
Yeah.
It was fairly straightforward. And he sort of criticised members of his own team, didn't point fingers at anyone in particular, but suggested that they spent too long looking at the computers and the data and not enough time simply looking outside at the weather. In that situation, it must be extremely tempting to try and rely on all the numbers in front of you rather than doing the much berated action, which is to put your hand out underneath the awning of the pit wall.
I mean, we've seen it in Formula One over recent years. Somewhat ironically, it seems to be Mercedes that have done this, where they've come out after they've done something wrong. I think it was Monaco 2015, Australia this year. And not to do with the weather, but to do with, oh, this is what the computer said, and not actually someone saying, yeah, but hang on, guys, this is the reality. I don't know if Ferrari were trying to be too clever. And then Maurizio Arrivabene comes out and says, oh, I'm angry. And you get that feeling of, yeah, but then who's in charge? Are you in charge? Do you trust your people? Have you got the wrong people in charge? Have you given them the wrong orders? And then it contrasts with what Sebastian Vettel's saying of, as he has done the last few races, he's not thrown his team under the bus when he's had the opportunity to do so. He could quite easily have come out and said, I told them it was wrong. I don't understand why they did it. You know, he knew immediately, but he had that faith, whether right or wrong. He came out afterwards, was very defensive, said, we decided as a team. Someone asked, yeah, but whose call was it? It doesn't matter, it was our call. And then you've got his boss kind of saying, oh, I'm angry that there was a mistake made. It's, yeah, be angry, but then why did you make it in the first place? Because you obviously didn't have the right method in place or the right tactics in place to work out what you were going to do in such a circumstance. And then even in that situation, if you're unsure, maybe the best thing to do is to split strategies and send one driver out on the safer option and one driver out on the gamble. You know, if you'd sent Kimi out on Inters and it had tipped it down, you could have looked like heroes. But the fact that you went with both drivers on the gamble is a bit perplexing, really, and it kind of sums up where Ferrari have gone. You know, these mistakes are just expected now, that everyone's kind of shrugging their shoulders and gone, oh yeah, look at what Ferrari have done again. A bit perplexing is a beautiful way to summarise the second half of Ferrari's season. We'll come back to Ferrari momentarily, of course, when we get to their race results. I do want to touch on, though, Toro Rosso. This is a home race of sorts for them, given the Honda power unit in the back of the car. Yeah, very much so. This is the first time competitively they've used the latest spec of Honda engine. They'd introduced it in Russia but didn't qualify or race with it. It does seem to have brought them a fairly significant step to the point where they qualified, granted in the conditions slightly unusual given Ferrari wasn't exactly on it and etc., qualified fairly high up in the order, looked fairly optimistic for the race. But Toro Rosso's been that team where it's been so up and down over the course of the season. Is it fair to read into this result as being a significant step forward in the power unit, or is it just one of those days where everything seemed to come together for them? I think so. They were quite excited before the race about what Spec 3 could do. And consider that I don't think Honda really wanted to introduce Spec 3 when they did in Russia, but they kind of had to because of it being their home race in Japan. I think they ideally wanted to wait a couple more races, a couple more weeks to get the engine calibrated fine. Yes, you could say that Daniel Ricciardo had an engine problem during qualifying. Sebastian Vettel messed up. I think Sergio Perez made a mistake in Q3 as well. So there are three cars that, given a clean session in qualifying, could have quite easily been ahead of Toro Rosso, but the fact that they weren't goes to show that Toro Rosso, they did a good job. And you might only be talking about fractional gains from the power unit, but that's all in a midfield fight. That tenth or two, that really could be all you need to lift yourself from kind of that Q2 anonymity into battling for the lead in the midfield. Looking forward to the race now. Obviously, we had a couple of recovery drives set up, one being, as you said, Daniel Ricciardo, who started the race from 15th after a power unit failure or problem took him out in Q2, and Sebastian Vettel starting from 8th place. More attention, of course, was on Sebastian Vettel given the championship picture. Had a very aggressive and very successful first lap, it must be said. Got himself up to right behind the battling Max Verstappen and Kimi Raikkonen. It didn't go exactly as planned for him, though. For one, Verstappen knocked Raikkonen off the track. He got past Raikkonen in that sense, in that way. Yep. But after the safety car, he then obviously set his sights on Max Verstappen. Ended in a crash. Might not be surprised to learn when Vettel and Verstappen meet, it ended in a crash. At Spoon Curve, and this has divided a lot of people
in terms of who thinks that it was necessary for him to make the move or not. Spoon's not traditionally a place where you pass cars, it should be said, especially cars that are relatively equal in performance, relatively. What was your take on that accident?
I mean, I think there's two trains of thought here. He'd had a brilliant start. You know, he picked off the Toro Rossos, went past Romain Grosjean, profited from Raikkonen being forced wide, and then after the safety car, he was right behind Max. And he got a good exit from that kind of awkward highly cambered hairpin, and could see that Max's engine was derating or the battery wasn't full. So obviously, when you're in a racing situation, he is thinking, this is my chance. Now, he'd already passed Romain Grosjean at Spoon Curve, and later in the race he passed a few other rivals at Spoon Curve, that kind of medium speed left-hander at the back end of the circuit. And in that situation, when you see the closing speed, you can kind of understand why he went for it. The flip side is that you're coming up against Max Verstappen, who we know, you don't want to say has bent the rules when it comes to defending, but is one of the sport's best defenders and will take it right up to the legal line. You've also got the situation that you're on lap 8 of the race. Yeah, you want to get past Verstappen quickly, but you already know he's got a 5-second penalty. So in effect, Vettel was already ahead of Max at that point. And the fact that at the next, after Spoon, you've got a straight 130R chicane, and you're back onto the main straight shortly after you'd have DRS. So it's a fairly logical assumption that he would have got past pretty soon. Vettel's argument was that because he was already so close, he would have lost a lot of grip through being stuck in the dirty air and probably wouldn't have overtaken at the next corner. So I can understand why he went for it, but it's just... It was an unnecessary gamble. It backfired. It could have backfired for Max as well. Max could easily have spun. He was fairly fortunate to continue. Equally, Seb could have just bounced off the side and continued and gone up to third, and he might have looked fairly heroic and aggressive. To an extent, it hasn't really had a big impact on the championship, because at best Vettel might have challenged Bottas for second, but even then you're looking at a 60-point gap and not 67. So in the grand scheme of things, it might be seen as, there's this huge dramatic clash between two drivers. But I think in the context of the title fight, it hasn't really had an impact. And just to add to that, it was, Vettel was already warned. The previous day, after the post-qualifying interviews, Verstappen was asked, are you going to make sure you don't get in the title fight? And he kind of hit back and go, is it much of a battle anymore? I.e. kind of a little sly dig at Seb. So the fact he's already kind of signalled his intentions, the fact they've hit or come close several times before, and then after the race Vettel said, we know he's like that. It's like, well, if you know he's like that, why did you try a half-hearted, not a half-hearted move, but a move where the door wasn't closed, but it wasn't exactly kicked open.
To tie this back to what happened to Ferrari in qualifying, there's an interesting question of strategy at these key moments in title fights, these crunch moments, especially from Ferrari's perspective, where they are essentially out of contention. Mathematically, yes, and of course if there were a disaster that befell Mercedes, maybe they would find themselves back in contention. But is it fair to say that, given that the points difference was so significant even before Japan and the likelihood of winning the championship was so low, that this is the time Ferrari could throw, and Sebastian Vettel could throw caution to the wind and attempt these unusual qualifying strategies on the off chance it worked, and that Vettel would send one down the inside of Spoon, even though he knew it probably wouldn't work, because the alternative was particularly bleak anyway? Yeah,
I mean, they're kind of stuck in this no man's land of the title fight's not over, mathematically, but realistically, it is. So they're still thinking, maybe we can win the title, but then that's leading them... I don't know if it's a lack of confidence or that the mistakes have built up, but it's almost as if they're unnecessarily second-guessing themselves. Because you think of how different the dynamics would have been, had Sebastian Vettel not thrown it off the road in Germany, had the rain not struck at a crucial time in Hungary, and then had they not mistakenly stayed out too long, costing him the chance to overcut Bottas. Had they got their tactics right in qualifying in Italy, and then not... then Vettel probably would have been ahead, wouldn't have been challenged by Hamilton at the second chicane and wouldn't have spun, probably would have won that race. Had they not screwed up their outlaps in Q3 in Singapore. So all these mistakes add up, all these little setbacks add up, so the points difference becomes so big that the championship was effectively lost before Japan anyway. So it's the kind of the point of, were they right to try something different? Maybe. They could have looked like heroes if they pulled it off and won the race through some outrageously fortunate or outlandish qualifying success, and then managing to somehow keep the Mercedes behind in race trim. But that was never much of a realistic proposition anyway. So they could have been third. They ended up sixth or fifth and sixth, remembering that Kimi Räikkönen does indeed still exist. I don't know what more else there is to say about that. It's just kind of Ferrari being Ferrari.
And speaking of Raikkonen and Ferrari being Ferrari, he was the best placed non-Mercedes car for a time, or was in the best position to be the best placed non-Mercedes car for a time, when he was challenging Max Verstappen for third. At the start of the race, we mentioned he was bumped off at the chicane. Was still in contention after that, especially once Sebastian Vettel had spun his way all the way back down to the bottom. He was essentially back to where he started. And it was up to Ferrari to decide who should pull the trigger first in this then strategic battle at the first pit stop window. He was carrying a bit of damage, wasn't going perhaps as fast as he could have, and the idea, I suppose, was to bring him in early and take the advantage of a fresh set of tyres and hope to undercut Max Verstappen. But not unlike what we saw in Singapore, I suppose, with Sebastian Vettel, they pitted him straight into lapped traffic that held him up for about 5 laps. That's the kind of stuff that a computer does show quite clearly, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the kind of strategy where Ferrari seem to have done this several times, whereby you can understand the reasoning, but the execution is sloppy, in that you think, right, we think the undercut's going to work, and it did work for other teams, let's go for it. But, Kimi was already losing time to Max, then he came out in traffic, and you only need 1 or 2 cars or a couple of laps, because the difference between the leading cars and the midfield is so big that someone like Raikkonen can easily lose a second or 2 in a lap if they get stuck behind a Force India. And that's effectively what happened. Kimi got past the cars, but the time he spent through the S's, through that back end of the circuit, was such that he not only lost the delta time to Max, even with Max's 5-second penalty, but he then lost it to Daniel Ricciardo as well. So by the time Daniel Ricciardo came into the pit stop, he emerged quite comfortably ahead of Raikkonen. And with the damage, with the relative pace of the 2 cars, it meant that, 5th place was his, could have been 3rd, might have been 4th, ended up being 5th. And it kind of rather sums up the strategies Raikkonen seems to have received over the last few years with Ferrari. A one that's not really well thought through. You can kind of understand why they did it, but ends up being quite illogical and doesn't work. And it ended up Ferrari being the slowest of the front runners for the first time in quite a while. I think by the end of the race, I believe Raikkonen's tyres had just kind of dropped off a cliff, because he'd had to push in those initial laps after the pit stop to try and make up that time. So by the end of the race, he was lapping, I think he was kind of 4 or 5 seconds off of Lewis Hamilton, to the point where he crossed the line even half a minute behind Daniel Ricciardo and 50 seconds behind Hamilton. That's the kind of pace difference. Even accounting for Raikkonen in theory being the slower of the 2 Ferrari drivers across the course of the year, that's the kind of pace difference I don't think we've seen all year. Which is, even if you look beyond the mistakes Vettel made, the mistakes they made in qualifying, that mistake with the strategy, that's a huge gap that suggests that even if they had got it right to start with, maybe they would have ended up 5th anyway. That kind of repeat of Monza, where the pace just dropped off at the end to the point where a once close battle, you're sitting there thinking, God, I can't remember this. It seems weird to think how close this was at the start of the race, because it ends up being so large by the checkered flag. So the order at the front runners: Hamilton obviously won the race from Valtteri Bottas, Max Verstappen, Daniel Ricciardo, Kimi Räikkönen, Sebastian Vettel. To wrap up some of the stories from the midfield, the battle for best of the rest was fairly hectic, I think. Chaotic might be a way to describe it. It started off with Romain Grosjean being in the box seat for Haas, looking for a good position there, and he held it for a great period of time, right up until towards the end of the race. There was a virtual safety car to clean up Charles Leclerc's broken Sauber by the side of the road. And thereafter, Sergio Perez behind him mugged him on the, I suppose, virtual safety car restart or the resumption of racing. Complained, as we tend to hear Grosjean do, quite vociferously about the fact that he felt Perez had abused the virtual safety car rules. It's not the first time we've heard drivers complain about virtual safety car loopholes,
But I don't think in this situation there was really anything in this one other than a good start from Perez.
Yeah, I think Haas team principal Gunther Steiner afterwards said, it was just the relative fortune between the two cars. You think if virtual safety car comes in at a point where you're, say, running at high speed, it takes you longer to slow down. So you gain more than maybe someone who's going around a hairpin because they don't have to slow down as much. And then when you speed up, it's the same thing. So I think Grosjean was only about 2 seconds ahead of Perez when the virtual safety car came out. So there wasn't a huge gap between them. But then you lose that 2 seconds, and you can understand Grosjean. They restart. Perez takes to the outside of the chicane, goes around the outside of him at the chicane. It was a fantastic move, perfectly executed. But you can understand Grosjean kind of thinking, hang on a minute, I was a couple of seconds up the road here. How's that happened? So I think the virtual safety car, and we saw it earlier in the season. I can't remember which race exactly it was.
I think there was a situation in the Spanish Grand Prix, wasn't there?
Yes, you're right, it was Spain. Where they were saying, someone, I think it was Vettel, said, well, it is open to being abused, and Charlie Whiting came out and said, well, it isn't, because we have these very small mini timing sectors. But you can easily lose a 2 second gap. We've seen it in junior Formula when they had to adapt the system because they realised they got it so wrong. I think over time it will get better, but I think you're always going to get that differential. Some guys will profit, some guys will lose out. So maybe there's a way they can improve it, but it's racing. At the end of the day, someone's going to lose out at some stage. Maybe it'll be a case of what goes around comes around for Grosjean.
Wrapping up, one more story from the midfield. Toro Rosso, we mentioned them in qualified very strongly. The race went nowhere near as strongly as they'd have hoped, considering that they have, essentially home crowd fans here for Honda. Started with a poor start, but then thereafter just seemed to be out-executed in terms of strategy. It's not the first time this has happened with Toro Rosso. Their race strategy and race execution is sometimes a little bit sloppy, and a disappointing place for this to happen in particular.
It was. I mean, you only had to walk around the circuit to see that outside of the obvious support for Ferrari, for Mercedes, that there was a lot of people supporting Toro Rosso, a lot of passionate fans, ostensibly because of the Honda, the Honda partnership. And in qualifying, they didn't quite maximise everything because Pierre Gasly had fairly bad practice in terms of, I think there was a fuel pump issue in FP2 that cost him pretty much the whole session, which meant that they were then on the back foot in terms of that engine calibration that they hadn't done in Sochi. So he goes into qualifying maybe on the back foot a bit compared to Brendan Hartley. Felt that 5th place was possible had they calibrated the engine properly. So he's starting 7th instead, so he's already kind of lost 2 positions. They thought that from the FIA they'd been given the green light to change their settings under part firmware conditions to kind of get the engine to how they wanted it to be, but then the FIA came back and said, no, we've decided you can't. So they kind of had to go back to Saturday settings, which meant that he was already kind of concerned a little bit about reliability and didn't quite have the right settings. So that was one thing that started badly. But I mean, in the race, it was looking all right that he was keeping touch with Grosjean on the super softs, and thought, I could win this Class B battle. But they got undercut by both Force Indias. Grosjean had obviously, I think he'd already stopped. Gasly stayed out longer and was thinking, I think we need to pit, guys. And then comes out on softs, has already lost the positions to the Force Indias, comes out behind the Saubers and I think one of the Williams as well, so he's got to pass them. I think he got past a couple of them, but the problem then is because they didn't have that FP2 long run data, they went on the soft tyres rather than the mediums, and the soft tyres started to blister. And then those last few laps, I think the last 10 laps, he said the vibrations were so bad that he couldn't see down the straights. And his pace dropped off, was clinging on to 10th place, but got overhauled by Renault's Carlos Sainz Jr. during the closing stages, I think with 3 laps to go. And then on the other side of the garage, Brendan Hartley, it was kind of similar story, that whereas Gasly made a good start, Hartley, for reasons that he didn't know, thought he'd done everything right, launches off the line and just bogs down, has already lost I think 2 or 3 places by turn 1, and doesn't only bog down but gets so much wheel spin that he's already effectively wrecked the rear tyres, so he's grappling with that loss of traction, and then from there his race just gets kind of sucked into a negative spiral and comes home 13th. When you start 6th and 7th and your 2 cars come home 11th and 13th, that's not a good day.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And one more story to wrap up, a brief mention to Marcus Ericsson, the last remaining Sauber car. He started last, he had a crash in Q1, had also a gearbox penalty, I think it was. They changed the gearbox before the start of the race. He recovered to P12, that's 8 positions, that's fairly decent, even accounting for some retirements, by stopping behind the safety car very early on, I think it was lap 5, onto the medium tyre and running an extremely long stint, almost, you could call it a zero-stop race.
Yeah, very nearly.
It's familiar to Sauber, this kind of strategy. It tends to work for them, and I guess it's really the fact that they've developed some terrific long-run pace in this car in the latter part of the season, and he was able to do it.
It's a very well-balanced car, and that's kind of helped a skill of Ericsson, which it kind of flies under the radar, but he is very good at tyre management. His problem has been throughout this year, especially in comparison to Charles Leclerc, one lap pace. Mm-hmm. So you've often seen in qualifying that Leclerc starting, back end of Q3 or front of Q2, and Ericsson starting, maybe 15th, 16th, So they put him on the alternative strategy, and he's been frustrated by that fact that he hasn't been able to qualify well enough, and he was, I think, 9th in FP2. So you're thinking through the weekend, it's a good chance for him to really get in that midfield fight, because he goes well at Suzuka. He spent a season racing in Japan in Formula 3, but it's just that tiny mistake in qualifying. He was following Valtteri Bottas. Bottas moves offline, but that loss of downforce was just enough to edge him ever so slightly wide, off into the gravel, into the wall, plumb last in qualifying. So from there, he did make good gains. He passed a few cars, then kept Alonso and Van Dorn behind during the closing stages. Only came across the line. Sorry, Hartley and Alonso. They're separated by just a couple of seconds at the checkered flag. Very good race for him, but it's that kind of overriding frustration of, if he hadn't binned it in qualifying, probably would have been with Charles Leclerc either starting 10th or 11th. And even though Sauber's long-run pace maybe wasn't as good as they thought it was pre-race, you'd like to think that he probably would have been in that battle for the lower points-paying positions rather than being 12th. So it's that kind of combination of, he had an excellent race from where he started, but had he started higher up, he would have got a better result. Yeah. So there's two sides of the coin there.
Yeah, exactly right. And that sort of wrapped up an interesting, chaotic, but ultimately, I suppose, predictable result for the Japanese Grand Prix, the championship moving only further out of Sebastian Vettel's grasp. And now we all wait to see what will happen at the United States in 2 weeks' time. Phil, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you very much, Michael.
That was Phil Horton from Motorsport Monday and Motorsport Week. The Strategy Report is a Beer Mogul podcast powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. You can get every episode by subscribing on Google Podcasts and Apple Podcasts, or on your favourite podcasting app. And you can leave a review to help other F1 fans find the show. You can also read the written report at f1strategyreport.com and stay up to date by finding us on Facebook and on Twitter. My name's Michael Lamonato. You can find me at Michael Lamonato on Twitter, and I'll catch you in 2 weeks' time for the United States Grand Prix.